welcome back to the NASA Citizen Science Community Workshop Series. I'm your host, Sarah Kirn from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. First, as always, some quick reminders. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves if you've not done so already. And if you find that chat distracting, close it or move it aside. Note that the chat default is to send your chats to panelists only. When you write a chat note, use the blue box just above where you type to redirect your comments to where you want them to go. Please use the Q&A tool, which you'll find in the footer next to the chat tool, to submit questions for our speaker. You can now vote for questions in the Q&A tool and comment on them. If a question seems to vanish, look at the top of the Q&A window for the tabs to access answered questions. It's probably there. Today's event is the 7th in our series. In recent weeks, we've heard about the value of citizen science as a tool for responding to crises, challenges, opportunities, and strategies for broadening participation in citizen science, the benefits and value of using citizen science data in conjunction with other data sets, and we scratch the surface of the many challenges and considerations associated with designing citizen science projects to meet their particular goals and engage their intended audiences. Today, we'll hear from a scientist leading a citizen science project where many of these themes come together. While Julia Parrish is not a NASA scientist, her project has delivered on NASA's Science Mission Directorate goals for citizen science of advancing scientific research and building understanding of the process of science. Her 20-year-old Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, or COASST project, has uncovered new knowledge about the dynamics of coastal ecosystems and food webs and engaged multiple generations of people in science. Before we hear from Julia, Dr. Marc Kuchner has a short announcement for us about an important citizen science funding opportunity and a new NASA citizen science project. Marc?
Hi, it's me again, Marc Kuchner, Citizen Science Officer for the Science Mission Directorate. I want to tell you about two opportunities that I didn't mention last time because the calls aren't actually out right now, so you'll need to keep your eyes peeled. But these are both relevant to our discussion of broadening participation in citizen science, and the programs are continuing. The established program to stimulate competitive research, or EPSCoR, is specifically about broadening participation. It provides seed funding to help certain states and regions develop their aerospace-related research capabilities, and that includes all our favorite kinds of NASA science. In 2020, the topics of interest for this program include citizen science. The proposals are only accepted from a limited list of institutions that have not participated equitably in the past in U.S. aerospace research. The Science Activation Program is not about providing science research funding. Its goals are enabling STEM education, improving U.S. scientific literacy, and advancing national education goals. These cooperative agreements last up to 5 years, and that enables the building of long-term relationships, which people mention as being important for broadening participation in citizen science. In fact, the SciAct 2020 call emphasized engaging subject matter experts with learners and broadening participation. It doesn't specifically say citizen science, but I think you can see where that could fit in. So keep checking the NSPIRE's website to see when the next EPSCoR and SciAct calls come out, or go to your NSPIRE's email subscriptions page and subscribe to the Science Mission Directorate email list. While I have you, let me tell you about a new NASA citizen science project that just launched last week. It's the Catalina Outer Solar System Survey, led by Carson Foles at the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory of the University of Arizona. The project, hosted on the Zooniverse platform, asks for your help finding new icy bodies in the outskirts of the solar system. Give it a try. You might discover the next Pluto. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Marc. Today's keynote speaker, Dr. Julia Parrish, is a professor in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences in the College of the Environment at the University of Washington in Seattle. Julia's research and academic interests follow three major routes: marine conservation, seabird ecology, and the behavior of organisms living in groups, like schools of fish or colonially nesting seabirds. Dr. Parrish has been recognized for her scientific work, for her contributions as a collaborator, and her advocacy of science and citizen science. In 2019, she was elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, and given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Pacific Seabird Group. She also served with Dr. Raj Pandya and Darlene Cavalier, both earlier speakers in our series, on the National Academy's panel that produced the report, Learning Through Citizen Science, Enhancing Opportunities by Design. In 2017, she and the COASST project were recognized as the outstanding partner of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Alaska region. And in 2016, she was elected as a Fellow of the Ecological Society of America. She currently serves as a board member of the Citizen Science Association. Her work is centered on the intersection between marine ecology, conservation, and resource management, and how non-experts and non-scientists can be involved in documenting patterns, collecting baseline information, and being an essential part of a science team. She runs a large citizen science project, the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, or COASST, which she is going to tell us about today. We are so lucky to have her here to share her knowledge and enthusiasm with us. Julia, take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm really glad to be here today, and I really want to talk to you about citizen science in the context of climate and climate change and the pandemic, COVID-19, that we're living through today. So I want to start here. This is a really, really interesting paper that came out a few years ago now that looked at all sorts of different mortality events across different organisms. And you can see that there are 6 panels of mammals, of birds, of amphibians, reptiles, fish, and invertebrates. So we can focus in on the birds. And the story there is that bird mass mortality events, or MMEs for short, are on the rise. And if you look at this a little bit more, what you can see is that most of that is due to disease and to biotoxins, at least with respect to what's published out there. And we asked, really? Is that the case? Is that really happening? And so I'd like to tell you about our program, the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team. So we're not looking at all birds, we're just looking at marine birds. So that's seabirds, shorebirds, and marine waterfowl. And in COASST, we do standardized searches, and they're repeated monthly, and they're effort controlled, so they all start in the same place and they stop in the same place. And the data are collected in ways such that they're verifiable. And those data are beach birds, beach gas birds. Okay, so here's a question that I want to ask. Can we use mass mortality events, or MMEs, in seabirds to discern underlying or forcing patterns, sort of bottom up from the environment up to the upper trophics? So to do that, we look at COASST data. So let me tell you a little bit about COASST. So here's some beach bird stats. COASST is about a 20-year-old program, and right now we have about 460 sites from Mendocino, which is in Northern California, all the way on up to Kotzebue, and actually we round the corner up in the Arctic to Utqiagvik. We work in about 90 coastal communities. All of those people for all of those years have found about 85,000 unique bird carcasses. Sometimes they find them more than once. So we've got about 880 active participants in our beach bird program, trained about 5,000 people. Most of those people are female. Some of them are STEM folks, science, technology, engineering, and math. About 12% of them are educators of some type. A bunch of them are retired, so average age is 51. But here's a cool fact. About 15% of coasters come from 2 or 3 generation families. So basically, parents taking their kids out, kids going out with their grandparents, all 3 generations going out at the same time. So COASST not only is a science program, it's actually a social program. It's a family event as well. So what do you do if you're out there on the beach? Well, we train coasters in a 5-hour single day training how to do 2 things. First, survey your beach. and you're looking for marine birds, beach cast marine birds. You're starting at one point, you're surveying the entire beach down to a stop point, and then you're coming back. So you search the entire area of the beach. And when you find a bird, you're doing this stuff on the left that you can see this couple doing. Measure, take measurement information, collect condition information. How fresh is that carcass? Is it all intact, or are there just pieces of it? You identify it, and you photograph them. And so here are some of the data types that we collect. We identify the foot type. We take 3 measurements of the bill, of the wing, and of the foot. And we collect 2 photographs, a belly shot, like you can see here, and then a back shot. So what do we do with these data? We roll them all up over time, and we create baseline calculations. So this is known as the encounter rate, and you're looking at a graph that's a regionalized encounter rate. So it's all of the beaches within one region. You happen to be looking at the northern coast of Oregon. And you can see along the x-axis time in months, and on the y-axis you can see encounter rate, and that's measured in carcasses per kilometer. So if your beach is a kilometer long, it's just a straight count. But if it's a 1.5 kilometers long, or 2 kilometers long, or only 800 meters long, we standardize to a kilometer in length. And that allows us to put all of those numbers together. So the black line that you're seeing here is the average measurement over all of those beaches, and also many, many different years. And the yellow wash is a measure of variability, here the 95% confidence intervals. So that line plus the yellow wash is telling you what's average, what's normal, what's the baseline. What are the gray bars? The gray bars are what actually happened in a particular year. In the year I'm showing you here, which is 2010 to 2011, what happened. So you can see that that second hump of the tripartite curve was really large in that year. That happens to be winter kill. And the first one, which is post-breeding mortality, which is normally large, that's the highest signal we get in the baseline, was fairly low in that year. So that's just one year, but we can stretch that graphic out over several years, and we get something that looks like this. And I'm just going to circle that 1 year so that you can place it in that several year average. So what you can see here is that the baseline and the gray bars pretty much mirror each other, and that makes complete sense, because in fact the baseline is made from the gray bars. So every day somebody in COASST goes out on a beach and gets information and puts it into the system, and in fact that changes the baseline just a little smidge, just a little bit. So we use these data, and this is the most important thing that we do in COASST. We use these data to figure out what is the baseline signal. What would we expect year in and year out at a certain time of year in a certain location along our geographic reach? So along the west coast of the US and then up into Alaska. Here's the baseline of that same place, the northern coast of Oregon, extended out a little more. And here you can see the second pattern that we see, which is divergence from the baseline. So here's a mass mortality event, and it's outlined in red, and we do that automatically with a set of statistics which are picking out signals that are untoward, that is larger than we've ever seen before. These two bars happen to be of a mortality event of a specific species, the Cassin's auklet, shown here both in life. It's a little bird about the size of my fist with a cute little eyebrow that makes it look like it's always questioning what's going on. And then a rather unfortunate photograph of many, many, many Cassin's auklets who washed up on the beach. So what happened in that particular mortality event? Well, it was a super interesting event. During that event, which happened in 2014, 2015, the Northeast Pacific Ocean, so the part of the Pacific that's north of the equator and close to the west coast of the US, got very, very warm. Experienced what we now know of as a marine heat wave. In fact, this is the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave, the largest, longest lasting marine heat wave so far on the planet. And during the height of this heat wave, part of the ocean that was about the size of Canada got stuck on warm 3 to 4 degrees centigrade above normal. So what did that big blob of warm water do? Well, it did two things. Up in the top of the graphic, you can see it changed the prey size. And it actually even changed the species distribution. It changed the whole ecosystem. So prey changed from larger, more lipid-rich prey to smaller, much less calorically rich prey, making it harder for birds that eat small things like krill and copepods to forage. The other thing that the blob did was it made all of the ocean water warmer than normal. You can see in the bottom, there's a graphic where red is warm and blue is cold. So the only part of the ocean that was cooler than normal was a thin strip of ocean right along the land. And that's typical along the West Coast in the summer because of upwelling events. So the good water, the cold water that housed good prey was smashed right next to the coastline. And all of the Cassin's auklets in the world, over 5.5 million of them, smashed into that single strip of cold water post-breeding. Unfortunately, that cold water is only maintained by seasonal upwelling that happens during the summer. And when it eroded in the fall, all of those birds crowded into that coastline, starved to death. However, because they were so close to land, much closer than normal, they washed ashore. So this event was interesting because it not only changed what the live birds did, it changed the propensity that they would actually get to shore. And that's why we got so many of them. So if you just look at the ecosystem, what the live birds are making, we can create a model of that, which we did. And we looked at a whole bunch of things that might influence the number of Cassin's auklets washing to shore. Each one of these dots is a different year. And 2014, a really bad, big mortality year, is in red. And you can see that basically the model suggests two things. That bad food, that is the number of small copepods, tells us, can predict for us how many Cassins are going to wash ashore. And also habitat, that is the amount of ocean that's warmer than a degree. But 2014 is really pulling that graphic up. And so what happens if you remove 2014? You still see the signal. And this is a really cool thing, because what this suggests is that environmental forcing, bottom-up forcing, in this case, things that are changing the habitat, storminess, and things that are pushing a change in the ecosystem are setting how many Cassins are going to wash ashore every year. So we're actually seeing the trace of environmental forcing in the data set in COASST over time, even without a mortality event. Really, really interesting science. So we've done a whole bunch of science of different mass mortality events. I've just told you the story of one, the Cassin's auklets, but there are stories on common murres, on tufted puffins, on shearwaters, on all sorts of different seabirds. And that's one of the things that COASST does. It takes our data, it puts them together with environmental forcing event, and we work with lots of different scientists, and then we put together documentation in the peer-reviewed literature that is what happened and what caused it. Okay, so you can take all those different mortality events and you can put them on a timeline stretched out over space. So there's 4 railroad tracks here. The one on the bottom, the longest one, is the lower 48 coast data, Washington, Oregon, California. And then there are 3 different places in Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska, and then hopping over the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians into the Bering Sea, and then the North Bering and Chukchi, which we started later. And each one of these circles is a mass mortality event. And I've told you about one of them, the Cassin's auklet event, this yellow event here, and I showed you some peer-reviewed pictures of common murres and also of tufted puffins. And so what you can see here when we just look at the mortality events is, although there are small-scale mortality events, each one of these circles is scaled to the maximum encounter rate that we saw within the regions that were affected. So even though we can see that there are mass mortality events pretty much all of the time. When we get to about 2013, 2014, they radiate up into Alaska, and when you collapse them down on top of each other, we have ones that are much larger, so the circles are larger, and they become collectively across the lower 48 and Alaska much more frequent. So more frequent and much larger, higher magnitude. So we can ask the question, has there been a shift in that biological response that's been provoked or pushed by the physics, by the underlying forcing? So let me show you some really simple graphs of the physics. Here's a graph from the Arctic, and I've put the main point of the graph on the top. This one is showing you that the ice is melting. So this is the trace of ice cover in the northern Bering Sea. So that's right up smashed against where the Arctic is starting. And blue is average. Yellow is warm, and red is quite warm. And you can see that in the northern Bering Sea, we have this really interesting phenomena which we call stanzas. So there are sets of years that are colder and sets of years that are warmer. And right now you can see there's a lot of red. We're in a warmer stanza. So the ice of the Arctic is melting, exposing the northern Bering Sea and the Chukchi for longer and longer. Here's a different way of looking at that. Again, this is over time from the year 2000 to the year 2020, so 20 whole years. This is sea surface temperature anomaly. So it's the long-term difference from normal. So white or no color at all is normal or below normal. And yellow is above long-term normal, which we set at 0. Red is 1 degree above normal, and dark red is 2 degrees above normal. So you can see a few things here. Each stripe of this graph is a different place in space. So the lowest stripe there is in California, and the top stripe all the way up at the top is in the Chukchi Sea, right? So we're going from south up to north. And you can see a few things here. You can see that in the north, particularly in the Chukchi Sea, it's been warm. There's been a warmer signal for a long period of time. So when we hear that people up in the north, in the Arctic, are saying that they are dealing with climate change and climate warming, ocean warming, and they have been for decades, they are not lying. The physical signal is right there. You can also see that after about 2014, the ocean got stuck on warm. And that big blob of warmth actually divides out into 3 separate signals. So one is the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave. That's the phenomena that got the Cassins auklets that I told you about. It really changed the average temperature of the ocean from the Gulf of Alaska down into the lower 48. But there are 2 other signals that I just want to point out here. One is an El Nino, a weak El Nino that happened in 2017, mostly in the California current, large marine ecosystem. So that's California, Oregon, and Washington. And the other one is the loss of Arctic sea ice, that warm stanza that I just showed you a picture of. So those 3 sources of warming, the heat wave, an El Nino, and a loss of Arctic sea ice, have really changed the Northeast Pacific system all the way on up into the Bering and Chukchi Sea for many years at a time. We are seeing a different ecosystem today forced by physics than we did 5 or 10 years ago. So has there been a shift in mass mortality events over time? I'm just going to show you 2 graphics, one of magnitude and one of frequency, where we can take that forcing and we can look back at all of those mortality events I showed you in that bubble plot. So here's a graphic that shows you sea surface temperature anomaly, so difference from long-term average on the x-axis, and the magnitude, so how big those circles are, where each circle, each point on this graphic is a different MME. And you can see here that basically, and not surprisingly, sea surface temperature is forcing magnitude. So as the ocean gets warmer and persists in warmth, we're seeing more and larger, we're only seeing larger in this graphic mortality events. Here, you can see that we're seeing an intersection with frequency. So as, again, on the x-axis, you can see we go towards warmer, long-term warmer. On the right, we're seeing an increased probability. Now, this graphic is a little hard because it's smashed down because we're looking at the probability of occurrence all the way on up to 1. So what I'm going to do is just expand this axis a little bit here. And what you can see here is that looking at sea surface temperatures, they can get warmer than long-term average. And once they get to about a degree above long-term average, we get a step function or a sudden discontinuity and increase in mass mortality events. So what we can see from this kind of analysis is there's been a northward migration, and it's a secondary effect of the response to warming. That is, it looked like those mass mortality events were migrating to the north, but actually it was just that the Arctic warming was coming on a little bit later. And second, we can see that there was a step at 1 degree of sea surface temperature anomaly. So if the ocean in our part of the world gets 1 degree warmer than long-term normal and stays that warm, what we can expect is that millions, and I am saying millions, of seabirds are going to die. So what's the goal of all of this? Well, in COASST, one of our main goals is science, and that's a big goal of citizen science, to go out and collect amazing data on science. But there are 3 other goals that I want to touch on just briefly here: education, community, and enjoyment. Education. When somebody walks into a COASST training, are they a bird expert? Actually, they're not. So this pie chart shows what people think they know about bird identification when they walk into a training. And you can see the green and the blue represent no experience and beginners at identification. So fully half of the people are pretty darn certain that they can't identify any birds at all. And this is a graph of how accurate coasters are at identifying birds, which is on the y-axis here, as a function of how many carcasses they've found. So walking out of a COASST training, 5 hours later, you're at this intercept, right? You haven't found any carcasses yet. You're down here towards 0. How good are you? Turns out that you can identify 7 out of 10 carcasses on average. Again, that's not because you started as an expert, that's because you learned. So a really good training, a really good protocol that takes science and tears it into little pieces that people can easily swallow and get, means that you can make people experts at a narrow wedge of science. And that's actually what we do in COASST. This graphic also suggests that as they practice, as they find carcasses, they're going to get better up to an asymptote or a flat point. And that's at about almost 90%. So after a year of doing COASST, the effective practice, you can identify almost 9 birds out of 10. So you not only get practice by going out and doing your COASST surveys, you get information on the COASST website about all of the mortality events and all of the science we're doing. We don't put our peer-reviewed work on our website. What we do is create science updates of all of that work. So translating into language that's appropriate for non-science experts is really important here. Here's another lesson from COASST. It's about community. This is a map of die-off events where birds have washed in at the northern Bering Sea and up into the Chukchi Sea. These are locations where we don't have a lot of coast long-term beaches, and people from indigenous communities and fishing communities are reporting these. So there are different kinds of data than the long-term monthly coast data. So one of the things that we have to learn is working with communities and inventing things that are working for them. In COASST, that led us to work with the Aleut community of St. Paul Island Ecosystem Conservation Office, or ECO for short, to create what we call Die-Off Alert. which is a training that we have implemented Alaska-wide. So you can go out and you can do die-off alert if you see beach birds, dead birds on your beach with your cell phone, just by arranging them, putting a scale in, and we give scales out to all of the communities, taking a picture and literally texting it to COASST. And this data, the die-off alert data, has helped us to be able to bound all of the mass mortality events that are happening in places where we don't have regular monthly surveys, and people are just not set up to do that, but they are set up to do die-off alert. So working with communities and doing things that they want to do and working in dimensions that they think are appropriate can add to science on both sides, Western science and Indigenous science. The final lesson is enjoyment. So one of the things that we really figured out in COASST is that science is social. What are you looking at? You're looking at a network analysis. So each colored dot is a person. People are connected to each other via lines, and that's because they've gone out on surveys together. So the bigger the dot, the more surveys you've done. And the thicker the line, the more surveys you've done with the person that you're connected to. And the color of the dot is when you joined COASST. And you can see there's a little key down in the lower right-hand side. So what I want to show you is that although lots and lots and lots of people go out just in dyads or triads or in little groups over time, there are some large networks that evolve. And I want to just pick out that largest network and blow it up. So here's that really large network. This network has 506 coasters in it who regularly survey, who have been active for more than a year. And if you include all of the people that they took out just once, that's 949 people all connected together in one social network. So one thing that we really need to learn is science is a really social activity, especially in citizen science. So why do people join COASST? Here's a quote from somebody who just joined COASST as a new coasters. I want to learn more about local birds and interact with the coastal environment. So these data that you're looking at on the left-hand side are from people who are just joining, asking them why they joined. And on the right-hand side from seasoned coasters, people who have been there for a year or more. On the top, they're talking about objects that they care about, and on the bottom, they're talking about actions. So what can we see here? The strongest pairings are that people want to be outdoors on the beach and they want to learn about birds. And the largest increase from new to seasoned is that people want to help with science. So people join because of the beach and the birds, but they're moving towards science over time. Coasters also talk about the power of the collective. Everybody in COASST identifies the data as important. And here's a quote from a coaster: just knowing you are contributing to something that has some value is important because you've got an organization with almost 1,000 volunteers. The fact is that you are able to glean all sorts of information. That makes it purposeful and powerful. People in COASST know they make a difference. So the goals: science, education, community, and enjoyment, those 4 goals. And that's because with those 4 goals, people talk to each other about COASST. So on the top graphic here are people they talk to regularly. Their friends, their family, coworkers, other folks on the beach, their neighbors, people in other environmental or community groups. And you can see that everybody in COASST talk to those people about COASST. But on the bottom are communicators and decision makers, people like resource managers, politicians, and reporters. So this is a glass half full, half empty diagram. White means they never talk to them. And so you can say, well, Julia, most of your coasters never talk to communicators and decision makers, but look at it the other way. 20 to 40% of coasters have talked to resource managers and politicians and reporters. And remember, that represents hundreds of people who are talking to decision makers about COASST. So this is actionable science through a social network to decision makers. And what do they talk about? 7 reasons that COASST makes a difference. We do climate impacts, we do harmful algal blooms, we look at changes in predator distribution and abundance, we tackle fishery bycatch and competition, we document disease outbreaks, we have a whole marine debris program, and really we are looking at habitat change and ultimately population carrying capacity of upper trophics like marine birds. So let me go back to social for one moment. This is a graphic that shows you on the x-axis the number of different partners you've had as a coaster over time, and on the y-axis, how many you go out with at any point in time. And you can see people down here in the lower left corner, they're the loners. They have less than an average, half a person they go out with on average, and they don't have too many partners over time. And let's consider COVID-19. So this graphic that I've included here is the percent of surveys done alone over time from July or June 2013 through June of 2020. And you can see that there are a lot of loners in the program. About 50% of the people go out alone. And that's that green line that's going up and down and up and down. But look, and I've put them in orange, the months after COVID-19 broke. So the number of people that are going and doing COASST by themselves is increasing. And that's because they're worried about COVID-19 and they're worried about being infected. And so that's changed the social dimensions of COASST. And it's something that we're worried about with hands-on environmental out-of-doors citizen science. Here's another way of thinking about COASST and COVID-19. This is coaster Laura and her 10-year-old grandson, and they're identifying a black-legged kittiwake using just the wing. Because the whole family is spending lockdown together. And Laura reports that he has become, quote, quite interested in our beach bird survey, a great lesson for him during homeschooling. So the other thing that we found in COVID is that families are doing COASST more, and parents and grandparents are using COASST as training, so education of the future. So I hope that I've convinced you in this talk that science is for everyone, not just scientists, right? And if there are three things that you can take away from this presentation, you got to know your science. You have to plan it well, it has to be rigorous, and you have to do it that way and publish it. But you also have to know your participants. You have to know what motivates them, you have to know that they learn, and you have to use both of those pieces of knowledge, your science and your participants, to extend the other. That is, science and participants go together. So we can make science bigger and we can make science for everyone. Thank you so much.
Julia, that was terrific. Thank you so much. I'm really curious how you know so much about your coasters. Have you collected those data yourself, or are you working with evaluators? What are your primary means of collecting information about the coasters?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Sarah. We do a whole range of things. So I would say that COASST is not an island at all. So both on the natural science side and the social science side, we have lots and lots of collaborators, and we work with all of them. So within the social science realm, we work with evaluators. We work with collaborators where we're trying to ask very particular questions, sometimes about motivation or identity. We have a really rich, deep project right now that's looking at people's attachment to place or sense of place and how that interacts with critical thinking. So we do all of that. And we also do separate surveys because we want to find out in COASST whether people are really getting the training, right? Because if we think we're doing a good job and we're actually not, and people are just being polite, that's not going to work so well. So for us, it's all about that sort of adaptive feedback loop of doing it better, doing it better, right? Because that makes our science better.
Right. So from a project sustainability perspective, I imagine it's helpful to be both able to go after science grants, but maybe also social science grants. Is that true? That the one helps you sustain the program, or they both do?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that our science, our natural science, became much better once we discovered that data collectors are people. So citizen science is a way to extend mainstream science, but it's so much more than that, because unlike a satellite or a buoy or even a hobo temperature recorder that you put out there in the water, people can talk to you. So they can collect data, but they can also talk to you. So let me give you a really good example of that. Or a beach bird program, but people also collect and record opportunistic or anecdotal information about other things, which they give to us. And we had a coaster team who sent us an email this past February and said, hey, we've noticed a change in Velella velella. That's a small gelatinous zooplankton, like a jellyfish, and they wash in on the coast. We've noticed a change from last year, and we're just wondering, are other folks seeing that? And we thought, gosh, good idea, good question. So we actually went into the database and looked at that, and that resulted in a pretty high-end modeling analysis. And we realized during that analysis, COASST holds more data on Velella beaching and the reasons behind it, that is marrying it to environmental forcing, than anybody in the world. Not just any citizen science place, any scientist. We have a 20-year record that goes over thousands and thousands of kilometers of coastline. And that's amazing. And that was in our data set the whole time, but it took a coaster asking that question. So when your data collectors can talk, they can think. And when you let them think and interact with you, science becomes better.
Yeah, what a great story. So you clearly have a lot of in-person interaction with all of your coasters because of that training, and they're interacting with each other on the beach. Do you have mechanisms by which they can interact with each other online? Are there discussion forums or?
Great questions. We have not done a lot of online interaction. So coasters within I would say like a 30 to 50 kilometer stretch of coastline, maybe up to 100 kilometers, it depends on the location, will get together. So often they know each other, they'll do stuff together. We have a set of folks on the northern coast of Oregon who not only do coast together, they put together floats for the 4th of July local parade, right? So there's, again, it's all sorts of the social aspect of science. We have recently, with the COVID-19 era, because we cannot go into local communities anymore, at least in the short term. We have started a series of webinars and interactions, and those have been just wildly taken up by coasters. And it's great, it's amazing, because now people from Nome can meet people from Mendocino, right? From Oregon can meet folks up in Bellingham. And so that's great, and they can ask the same questions, interact a little bit. So we do that. We maintain Facebook groups and Instagram, and we have a Twitter feed. We do those kinds of things, but that's more of a push us out to them.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that changes if, well, depending on how long we're in this current phase of operations. I know some of the NASA projects we've heard about, there have been really tremendous collaborations among citizen scientists through discussion forums that are really remarkable stories.
Yes, yes. And I would say, like the Velella, the jellyfish story that I told, there are folks, the COASST inbox and text feed is full daily, right? So they may not be interacting so much with each other, albeit locally, yes, globally, no. But boy, are they interacting with us.
Yeah, that's important. And my final question before I open this up a little bit. So you're really looking at these big regional kind of environmental events and connecting them with what people can see on shore. Are you using any NASA data in that analysis or in understanding what's happening? And can you talk about it? Yeah.
That's a great question. So we actually couldn't do what we do in terms of the modeling of either a particular mortality event or more broadly, looking at all of our data if we didn't have remote sensing data. And that's because in order for us to ask sort of ecological hypotheses, right? We need to know what the entire sea surface temperature field is, what's the entire wind field. If we're pushing up into the ecology of the system, what's the primary production? And the only way to get those data are satellite data. And so we use a range of NASA products and also NOAA products because there are satellites from both agencies up there. But without that, we wouldn't be able to do temperature, we wouldn't be able to do storminess, that surface roughness of the ocean. So all of those things together let us look either over a large scale of space and time, like annualized, or we can zoom down into a particular part of space, like the coastline of Oregon to 100 kilometers out at a particular month, and even actually down to a particular day. So that is super, super cool to do that. Zooming in, is there something that changed the physics of the system that's going to bump a lot of carcasses or pieces of marine debris to shore, and then way out to the year or the decade and say, is it changing? Are we seeing that chronic signal? And so that underlying remote sensing satellite data, oh my gosh, it's just, yeah, we couldn't do our work without it.
And final question, I have another one, so fun. To your knowledge, has your data ever been used by people who are focused on that remote sensing data to understand in more nuanced way what's happening on the ground?
Well,
so going backwards, instead of you using the satellite data to help you understand what's going on, do the satellite data folks ever use what you're seeing on the ground to help them interpret the signals that they're getting from their remote?
No, and that's, I think, because that would work if what we were doing was providing a ground truth, right?
Right.
So I think there are a lot of sit-sci programs where ground truthing might be really important. CoCoRaHS comes to mind, where the very, very fine scale in space-time of precipitation is really helping us understand what the remote sensing data are telling us. Another example is when we're looking at LiDAR of forests, and we really need people on the ground to go in and say, yeah, that's a particular type of tree, right?
Right.
So we're not doing that because our data is filtered through the ecology of the system. So it's translating physics and it's saying, what is the impact of the changing physical environment on the life of the planet that's sustained by that physics? And you could imagine that there might be some direct physical data that coasters could measure, but I prefer and think of it another way. This is a watery planet. Most of our planet is covered by ocean, and people don't go there. People live on the land. So we use satellites to tell us a whole heck of a lot about what's going on, at least at the surface, the top skin of the ocean. But what's going on there has massive, massive effects on biodiversity, right? And in fact, on how much production the planet sustains. And COASST is a frontline measure of that, right? And so that's our connection to the satellite data. They're showing us synoptically what's going on in the ocean, and some part of that ocean is washing onto the land, and we're that thin line between the ocean and the land. We are literally the first thing, the first place that we can pick up that signal.
I have tons of questions, and I know other folks will. So first, we're going to be joined by Marc Kuchner, and then we're going to take it to the public audience. So Marc, welcome.